Hey folks, welcome to Snowpal Podcast. Our guest today is Jermaine Jermaine at Airlight. Jermaine's a non-technical co-founder who headhunted his team to complement the mission that he's on. Is a founder and storyteller obsessed with how Jermaine spends his time, the work he does, and what he leaves behind. That's a quick intro, but that being said, Jermaine, thank you so much for taking time to chat with me.
Thank you. Thanks, Krish, for having me.
My pleasure. Before we get started, can you give us a brief intro about yourself, a bit about your background, what you do, where you live, to the extent that you're able to share anything about you and your business to the audience? That'd be awesome.
Yeah, so I've been a multiple time founder in a various variety of things. So, my most recent startup is in the legal tech space, but right before that, I have a logistics company. So we're talking shipping containers from Asia to the United States primarily, and sometimes a little bit of air export. So yeah, that has been my career is exact. I started off doing toy companies, so pitching toy concepts to Walmart, Target, Walgreens, getting them into stores, figure out those strategies of how do you put things on the right shelf to visually see it and to catch attention and to communicate to users that are walking by. And I've also done political finance, so fundraising for the former state treasurer of California. So I've done a little bit of everything. But at its core, I think I have always followed my curiosity. It's every time I think that something needs to be solved, I will just try to keep going and try to figure out what is the best way to put something together to solve the things that I'm thinking about at the time.
It's very refreshing to even hear that. It's very, you have a broad set of experiences there. It's amazing. So let me see. If I said that Jermaine is an entrepreneur who runs businesses where this happens to be an engineering business, would that be a better way to describe you than to say it's a developer who started a business?
Yeah, so I don't actually know how to code. I understand a lot about architecture and like front and back end endpoints, communication and things like that. But I think I am probably more like the person who has this vision, and that every year of my life I get better at carrying out the vision, whether that is to raise money, whether that is to put the team together. And most recently we probably have over engineered our product a little bit, so I have slowly become a conversion copywriter, and because out of need of building a B2C app to figure out how to communicate simple concepts of all the
You
things that
know,
we engineer.
You know what? I'm going to enjoy the next 60 minutes hands down because whatever you just said there built my curiosity already. The first thing I want to ask you, right? So, in no particular order, based on what you just said there, let's talk a little bit about what your current business is, right? And then I think that'll be a good place to start this conversation. Can you tell us a little bit about Airlight, what it does, and why you decided to do that essentially?
Yeah, so Airlight is a simple will maker. So we focus on three documents in the estate planning, which is your will, your health directive, which is the document that says who gets to make decisions for you while you're still alive. So if you're in a coma, for example, the doctor needs to know who can make decisions for you. And then the third document is the financial POA, power of attorney, which says while you cannot make financial decisions, who can access your bank account or things like that. So this startup started around a year ago, a conversation that I have with my parents. So my parents were just immigrants that came to the United States in the late 70s, early 80s. And we had chat about retirement. And what I realized is that for both my parents, it's never been a question about how much money or what kind of retirement they will have. But the question has always been this very deep sense of subconscious fear of what happens if you run out of money before you die. And so what I realized is that it's not because they don't have enough, it's more because there's a lack of clarity of what does what they have now translate into the rest of their lives. And most people put off thinking about this. And so I started building a chatbot to talk to my mom, to ask her, can you tell me stories about your childhood? Can you tell me about things that matter to you and the things that you want to pass on to people, the stories, the relationships? And what I realized a few months in is that if I had all this information, I can actually make a will for you. And so that's when we pivoted from a generalist chatbot of talking to my mom into an estate planning app.
Lovely. So, in other words, you didn't go looking for a problem to build software. You sort of stumbled into a problem, right? You want to make things better, and then that idea essentially led to the building of this company. Is that a fair summary of what you just said?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And I think to add on to it, it's just about clarity. It's about, helping people that we love, people that we care about find more clarity in their life.
Makes sense. The first of the questions I have for you is you mentioned that you're a curious person, you've done other businesses. Is this the first in the space of software, or have you had others that have been related to software development?
Yeah, so I've done a ad tech company. We had a internal software that's for kids to use, and then maybe built a few dashboards here and there. Yeah, it's not my first software. I think even I'm thinking back now, there's probably a bunch of small softwares that we've built, to solve things. And sometimes softwares can be masked by relatively called like a automation flow, like a very sophisticated Airtable that looks like a software. But this is the first time that I'm building a consumer-facing application, which is in itself an entire new world to try to go to market for.
I can only imagine. Okay, perfect. So that gives me a good idea as to what I'm thinking and what I want to be asking here. So you also mentioned you're a non I mean, you said you've become more hands-on recently, but by way of background, you're a non-technical founder, right? So let me ask, we are recording this in the first month of 2026, right? Uh, so the natural question with everything that's happening in the world, at least in the space of engineering, is you've heard this like probably a million times a day, this acronym. I'm just going to say it. I'm tired of saying it myself. I want to call it something else, but that's what it is, right? AI. Now, you, on one side, you are a problem solver, but your background is a non-technical person, meaning you've not written code or a lot of code yourself, but you're running a software company now. So the very basic question I'm going to ask you, you probably already know what it is could you have done this if not for AI? By AI, I mean code generation tools, Copilot and Cursor and everything else that comes with it. Could you have done it, say, 3 years ago?
Well, I'll answer for 3 years ago, no. Even for January 2026, the answer is still not really. And to qualify that, I do believe that someone who knows how to code, who knows how to build, knows how to prompt much better. It's like we have this concept of the 10x engineer. I think what is the biggest difference is that we don't have to hire as many junior developers as before because Cursor is pretty good, right? All the Claude code writing is pretty good. However, though, somebody who doesn't know how to architect a problem or a solution still will struggle with all the AI coding. And so this is why we do have excellent engineers. And I think I'll probably even take a step further with your question, which is, the way I have always thought about my co-founders, my CTO, my technical people, which is it's now less emphasis on the technical capability and more emphasis on the resourcefulness. When I present a product roadmap or something, let's just keep it even smaller, something that we want to build at X amount of time. Let's say I want to build a feature in 2 months. Now I'm looking for developers that can tell me not only is it possible, but under what conditions is it possible and under what trade-offs would we make to make something like that happen? So the resourcefulness of a developer has now risen to the top of what I'm looking for. Whereas maybe 3 years ago, I'd be looking for developers with experience working in certain kind of products, certain kind of authentication, or certain kind of database management. I think before it was more hard skills and the type of coding, but now it's more like the ability to be resourceful given AI's capability.
Jermaine, you articulated that more beautifully than I could have possibly done. I was going to ask 17 questions to get to those answers, but I had to ask half a question for you to have given me those 17 answers. So let's just dig deeper into each facet of that answer. And those are answers, by the way, I truly believe in myself. And if you go back to some of my podcasts, even the recent ones, I promise you I'm not making this up. I would have called out for something very similar, and my guests also have done the same. So your first point was many different things in no particular order because I'm not jotting down notes here. One of the things you said was the need for junior developers. And I'm going to quote Mark Zuckerberg, given what I'd heard him say more than once, was that Meta is pulling back or pull back quite a bit on hiring junior developers because they are able to get a lot of it done with tools, AI tools and technology. So the need for junior engineers is really not there. And to that, one of my guests had asked me, how does Mark reckon he's going to get a mid-level or a senior engineer if he's never going to hire a junior engineer? But then the natural answer that both of us thought to ourselves was, well, he's going to have other teams, other companies hire those junior people, possibly have them become mid-level or senior engineers and then onboard onto Meta, for instance. So let's focus on that for a little bit, and maybe I'll ask you things that might be very obvious, but it'll be very helpful to us. So the junior, so we take a non-technical founder and they're like, hey, you know what? I need to build something. I have a problem here. I need to build a software for writing legal documents, will, for instance, here. I have the problem domain. I know what I want to do, but I need some help getting it done. So, do you roll up your sleeves and say, you know what? It does not matter that I'm not a developer. I have no need, sometimes even money for a lot of us to hire a junior dev. So, I'm just going to use tools to get going. Is that the natural first step? Am I missing something? Or just please correct me and tell me what the natural thought process there is.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question because this is a question that I think, developers always think I can code something, I can create something to fix, to have a solution. And then marketing people are always thinking, but if you can make a solution, you have a product, but you don't know how to sell it, what is the point? And I think they both are right in some ways. And I think where we are today, with all this code assistance is that we're able to validate a problem much faster. So if I think of a challenge that I have in, I'm going to try to make up something right now. I would like to create a algorithm or a simple scheduling tool to deliver bottles of water that is purified from the mountain. And now I'm going to
Okay.
create a subscription tool or, I think with all these dev tools that we have right now, the most beautiful thing of it is that we can now first create a website fairly quickly. We can generate all the images. We can even use the assistance of AI to create all the copywriting. And now the most beautiful thing is we can even go into Mark Zuckerberg's Meta ad platform and mock up a few ads to see if there's a demand for it. I think prior to this 3 years of AI, all that would have taken such a heavy lift. And so now, if I'm a developer and I'm resourceful, I'm thinking, I have an idea. I'm going to try to see if someone's willing to pay for it before I go out and actually build it. And so I really think that we live in the best time even to be a junior developer because in the past, you have to prove yourself in many projects. You have to do all these things. But now a great resume looks like someone who's tried 10 and have a system, understands, how they validated an idea, how they pivoted that idea, and then they can have something to show for. Whereas before they would have to work in an org chart of hopefully working on the right team that puts them on the right path to go through, L1, L2, L3 all the way up. And sometimes people don't rise to the top, not because they're not good, but because maybe they lack the people skills to work on the right projects or they have a problem with their manager.
Jermaine, I'm going to digress intentionally for a moment because, this is unrelated to what you just said, which is beautiful. And I have some follow up questions there. But the reason maybe you'll appreciate why I'm digressing, hopefully. I did a podcast not too long ago talking about whether or not it makes sense to spend money and go to college today, right? It was a bit hypocritical in some ways because I did go to college, but that was decades or centuries ago. So things have changed. And I had my thoughts on whether or not you have to spend money. And one of the things I recall mentioning there was learning theory, the fundamentals from a theoretical standpoint, and going to the real world and doing it practically happen to be apples and oranges, right? It doesn't translate organically or naturally. You can tell when somebody is looking up, reading plenty of books and answering questions versus somebody who's lived through the pain or the joy of doing something. The reason I took this complete digression is your answer to my previous question was so on the money And I want to tell people that those kinds of answers generally come from people who have lived through that phase of life, personal and professional, right? And that's invaluable, right? I'm just doing a shameless plug, if you will, to a random podcast of mine, but that was not my intent. I just want to say that sometimes these answers call out for somebody who's actually done it versus somebody who's read it. So I really appreciate the specificity of your response there. That's just a thank you randomly in the middle of early part of the conversation. Now let's go back to what you said there. Let me put a name to it, right? What you said, let me call it, and correct me if I'm wrong, product market fit. 3 years ago, to get to product market fit, you had to look for money. I mean, if you're a non-technical founder, you had to look for money because you had to have somebody build it for you. That's changed now. You can have these tools build a lot of it for you. So you don't need to look for money. And like you said earlier, it took a lot of time and money and resources and a variety of different skills to get something to the point where you can begin to ask questions like, hey, you know what? Does this idea even make sense? Should I even be building this? Have other people built it? If so, how have they built it, right? But a lot of those steps have become a whole lot easier. Is that have I have a question, but did I summarize the gist of what you said there to some extent?
Yeah, I think so. I think there's way more information and much cheaper tools to get all those things done now.
So, which means the first natural question then is product market fit or showing something to somebody is not a skill anymore because a lot of people can show something to someone without a specific set of skills, right? I don't have to be a developer, I don't have to be an architect. I can just be somebody who can use these tools and build something. So, one of my first questions there, Jermaine, is does that negate, not negate, sorry, let me use a better word there. Does it change the way the world is going to look at software engineers? In other words, I mean, has something dramatically changed where what you're bringing to the table as a software engineer in the early days of your career, does that have to be dramatically different from before? And if so, what do you think those differences ought to be?
Wow. I mean, I don't know what would happen in the future, but I think I have always evaluated my software engineers differently because I think just being self aware of the kind of person I am, if you're someone who needs structure to grow, then you're probably looking at a software engineering job at a fairly established company. And I've always functioned in the space where we're going from 0 to 1 all the time. And so, to answer your question with that, I think what might be helpful for the listeners is if you're thinking about your career moving forward, perhaps there's no better time to look inward and ask yourself, what kind of job do I enjoy? You can stay in software, but what kind of a job, what kind of sector, what kind of vertical do I enjoy? If you have always worked in a big organization and what you realize is actually, I quite enjoy building things with more design. So now, with the availability of tools and more companies coming out, you can actually start thinking, maybe I don't want to do B2B dashboards anymore. Maybe I want to go do something like what Airlight is doing, which requires a lot of UI UX. And as I'm interacting with more UI UX designers, I can pick up a whole new skill and refine my engineering taste and how I build things. And so I think what AI has done to engineers is that it allowed engineers to have more options in terms of where they want to go with their skill set.
Okay, so let me understand that better. When I started my career, which was a long time ago, say I like programming, I like coding, so I was looking for a development job, right? It was reasonably straightforward. I'd done some level of programming in a few different languages in college, and I was looking for not the same, but anybody who would hire me to have me write some code. And the very specific skill I brought to the table was coding. Not so much coding in a particular language because I had done something differently back in college and my first job required something else out of me, which is the case for a lot of people, right? But that being said, I did bring that specific skill to the table, which was coding. They needed somebody to code. They interviewed. I went through the process and I became a coder in that company. Do you see that not be anything like that anymore? You mentioned resourcefulness. I want you to bring that into the mix, if that makes sense, to answer this question, if you will. How do you see Krish applying for a job 2 decades ago, hypothetically, to today? And as an employer, somebody who's hiring me, what would you have looked for then? I mentioned it, but what would you instead look for in me now? And if it's resourcefulness, can you just elaborate a bit on what you specifically mean by that?
Yeah. So I think there's two perspective here. So because of how software is, the bigger companies are also consolidating and having a big chunk of software engineers working on a bunch of projects. So, for example, Google has, I think, 100,000 employees or something like that. And 70,000, maybe 50,000 of them are software engineers or maybe even like data people. So I'll just bunch all that together. But if I think of the other side of it, which is there are now more and more small companies with potentially under 10 software engineers. In fact, Airlight, we have this goal of never having more than 10 engineers, no matter how big we scale, because maybe we don't need that anymore, just to ship products and just to maintain. But I think now, if we look at all these small businesses that used to not have a software engineer because either it's cost prohibitive or something, people can start thinking, I like to code or I enjoy solving problems by thinking about how to build a software layer on top of it. Now, there's probably a million things in the world that requires a little bit of software to make it even better. That could be a car wash that now with a software interface can actually run a lot better for its customer base, for its users, for everybody that's involved. That could be a accounting integration of the car wash payment system, for example. In the past, this owner of this car wash probably will not spend the money to hire someone to do it. But these days, because tools are available, most people know how to set up an AWS account and just get started, plug in some APIs on the back end to figure out how all these things talk to each other. Software engineers who are okay with not going into a big company, a structured system of rising from L1 all the way up to whatever a staff engineer is, they can now think about all the other things to build. So they can follow a little bit more of their creativity and follow a little bit more of their passion and still make a living.
Okay, so what you're saying there, tell me if this is correct, is that there is room for more entrepreneurs now, and there's the ability to become an entrepreneur more so than ever before, right? Because earlier you needed a lot of money, a variety of different kinds of skills, large teams, and funding, and yada, yada, yada. But now you probably don't need a lot of that and still can find a way to get your idea from ideation to production, essentially. Correct? Is that the gist of what we're saying there, right? And that's so true, and I could not agree more. So, and add to that, Jermaine, the fact that the job scenario is also going to change. Correct? Now, I'm not saying there's going to be fewer jobs or more jobs or whatnot. Time has to tell. But we are seeing that where you needed a lot of people to build something, you don't need nearly as many people. Let's go with your example at Airlight, where you said that you're generally seeing it as an under 10 people where you can get stuff done. Let me ask you this. If you could draw a parallel between something similar that you may have done 3 years ago and now, or maybe even manufacture that example from 3 years ago to what you're doing now, how did the composition of your team change? Let's say you have 10 people in your team today. What do you think is what is the composition in terms of roles and whatnot, and what it may have been 3 years ago?
Yeah, well, I think I may be talking a little bit over my expertise here, but right now, Airlight is set up that we have someone who's a back end person and a front end. The back end happens to also be our AI person, and he's just like I think he's very smart and very skilled at what he's doing. But what I like about him is that he's constantly learning and trying to figure out the new tools, right? And so when we're thinking about what would we possibly need to scale beyond him, it may actually just come down to probably data security for us, and maybe some kind of maintenance role just to make sure that everything is up 24/7 in that sense. But from a purely developing point of view, I really don't foresee us growing too much more beyond this. Just because at this point, everything that we can imagine out of our product development fits very well into the skill sets. Sure, if we launch a new product line, beyond estate planning, that it may be smart to bring some expertise in for that. But where we are today, gosh, well, our designing team is so good, and our front end app, basically the person who built our app, ZJ, is so fast with the help of Cursor that I just cannot imagine us expanding our team anytime soon.
Okay, which is amazing. Which is again very different from what it could have possibly been a few years ago. And in terms of the code that your team writes, like literally as a human writing code versus code being generated, let's say ballpark this, Jermaine, for as if you have 100 lines of code, how much of that code is actually written by a human versus generated using these tools?
Probably a very bad ballpark is, I think, 80% generated and 20% going back to make changes, editing, fixing.
Okay. And which is, I think, around the numbers that I'm hearing these days. And you mentioned resourcefulness is as a skill that you're looking for. So going back to my earlier question and an example of Krish being a coder and the main skill, or probably the only skill, not just the primary skill, let's say the only real skill that Krish brought to the table was coding. Would you hire somebody who's just a coder today? If not, what other skills would you expect for that person to have in lieu of coding?
Well, I think for me, it's going to be a combo. So if you're a founder thinking about how do you bring on a technical co-founder, the things that you definitely have to consider are availability, affordability, their skill set. And then at the end of it, because it's so early on, it's going to be culture fit and how does this person's work style and values fit to you. I will answer your resourcefulness point, but I probably be very helpful for me to tell you how I found my co-founders. So
Absolutely.
at the time, I was in Southeast Asia because I was there to visit my grandmother in Malaysia. And I was looking at potentially bringing on someone in California and understanding that the price point would be much higher. I started looking around Malaysia for a few reasons. First of all, Malaysians speak English pretty well as a cultural fit of being a communal culture versus a very individualistic culture in the United States. So I needed the co-founder to kind of understand my mindset behind a lot of things. So I ran a list of about 6,000 engineers. And part of the criteria was that I needed the engineer to have gone through a growth stage of a company. I didn't really care if the engineer was purely B2B or B2C. And essentially, we pulled a bunch of companies. I had hired someone to help me go through LinkedIn and pull out engineers. I believe it was 5 to 8 years of experience at the time from a venture or private equity backed startup that had gone through growth phase, and that was defined as 3x growth of top line revenue companies or raising series A or B. And these data are probably out there in PR Newswire and things like that. So we built a list of company, brought out about 6,000 engineers, and then I started going down the list, identifying people's progression in their career. So what I was looking for was people who had shown excellence. So what does that mean? If I had went to a boarding school and then I went to Harvard or UPenn, and then I went to consulting in the Big Four, that on paper is excellence. By every account, this person did everything they should have done given the circumstances that they're in. But that's not what I want, because the person that I want probably have the privilege of going to a boarding school, probably went to a very good university like Stanford or UPenn or Harvard, but then they took an unexpected path. And let's say they went to volunteer for a year somewhere in the Ukraine for a refugee center, for example. And that's what I'm always looking for in the people that I'm looking at, because I'm looking for any indication that this person has done something beyond what is expected of them. And typically for me, that shows me that one, their ability to take risk, and also two, that they don't conform to what society says they should do. And this version shows up in different cultures too, because in the United States is the culture that I showed you. But when I was looking at engineers in Malaysia, there is a lack of risk tolerance in a lot of countries in Asia. And so when somebody does take a step to move jobs, for example, that shows that they're willing to take risk. And then if they have a good narrative and a good story behind why they move each job, those are the things I'm looking for. So kind of going back to the resourceful idea, when I ask people about what I'm trying to build, I typically present to them a vision that is fairly big. For Airlight, the goal for Airlight is to have clarity in people's life, because even though it's not very transferable to software, Airlight's mission is that clarity is love in practical form. And so if you want to help the people around you live with more clarity, with more love and more full of life, we look to build tools to do that. And estate planning is one of those things where if you're not in legal space, it would be very intimidating. And so when I interviewed engineers, when I had these initial conversations, I can tell very quickly who was resourceful in their answers of being, oh, yes, and what about we can do this in this realm of bringing clarity using estate planning? Rather, if I hear answers like, well, what about the legal hurdles? What about, the lawyers think this, or are you worried that we're going to get sued? If too many answers in a row were answers that are like, why can't we do it? Which I think a lot of software engineers actually live in this mindset. It just tells me that it's not the right fit. And so the resourcefulness shows up kind of in the path of excellence in their career as well as in their answers to me.
Specific answer. Thank you for that. So, a couple of things to clarify there. A college degree, how important is it for you to onboard somebody onto the team?
I think it's not important at all for me, especially in the software space. Actually, in most business space, it's probably not important at all. My brother's optometrist, so that's probably quite important to have a degree.
Makes sense. In other words, if you're in a field where if you're a lawyer, because you need to be a lawyer to be going to court or you have to pass the bar, you're in medicine, you need certifications because the world needs to acknowledge that, hey, you are in fact capable of doing what you claim, and there's a governing body, it makes sense. But in businesses, but that's software, I cannot think of any role in software engineering, be a data architect or data engineer or UI, UX designer, developer, architect, and tester or DevOps engineer, SecOps engineer, sales. So a software company, a traditional startup or a software company does not need it. So I think it's a fair point to say. But before I go to the next item, I'm going to ask you one more time, right? Just to see if we'll change your answer. You get two resumes. You're doing a lot of comparisons, right? Comparing and contrasting, either intentionally or inadvertently, with a college degree, because you mentioned Harvard and Stanford more than once, right? To be honest. So does that make a difference to you? Or are you like, you know what? It's kind of good to see, but I don't really care.
So for me, if I need to raise money, maybe it helps because I can then put on my pitch deck and say, my founding engineer went to Stanford and then did this. But because I'm not trying to raise money, so understanding the game that I'm playing, I don't need to impress people who are external to give me money. Then it actually does not matter to me at all.
Great answer, right? So in other words, to get stuff done outside of the red tape and whatever else, anything that's bureaucracy unrelated, clearly people can do without the degree. The reason I ask is, we are in 2026 now. If someone's listening to it and watching it thinking, hey, should I borrow $100,000 to go to college for the next 4 years and then take 10 years to pay that off? Specifically to folks who are going to college in the US, I know it's not just as expensive in other countries, but I thought it was a fair enough thing to ask because people have asked me that question. So the next thing I want to ask you is, before I go to tech stack, I want to ask you, so the way you're hiring an engineer or anybody into the team, you had a certain set of requirements, right? Resourcefulness, and how you define resourcefulness is how Jermaine as a person defines it from a professional standpoint. So the question I want to ask you here, Jermaine, is there is no straightforward answer to what people might be looking for. In this day and age, people apply to thousands of jobs. And I saw something on YouTube the other day. She had a couple of years of experience and she applied to like a few thousand jobs with actually getting automated responses. And she shared her thought, just her emotional position at that point, saying what it meant to her as somebody going through that, right? It was very emotional. So the thing I want to ask you here is, you also mentioned people needing to enjoy what they did at the top of this conversation that we have here. So what I want to ask you is, since there is no, are we looking at a future where the requirements are not going to be so clearly defined, even in engineering companies like software companies? I'm not talking art. I'm talking companies that are building binaries that are executed by machines, right? It's as machine like it can become, right? It's not art and subjective. Even in those companies, are we now saying that you cannot you cannot be a cookie cutter, so to speak, because you don't know what people might even be looking for, because Krish might be looking for something different from Jermaine. So you're better off finding your calling as opposed to following the herd and doing what everyone's being asked to do. I ask this straightforward, for the reason I mentioned there, but also with the cultural background of somebody who was born and raised in India, where you had a path defined. Yeah, you go to school, you go to college, you even do your master's, and that's like everybody's got to do that. It's not a big deal. Now you have to separate yourself from the herd after that point. And when I moved here, I thought it was interesting and nice to me that not everyone had to go to college even years down the road. So, long story short, my question is, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think general so I would never advise someone generally about this topic because general advices are generally not good because everyone's circumstances are so different, right? Like somebody can listen to me say you should follow your passion, but the natural answer is like, well, lucky you that you can follow your passion because, so I will take a step back and say that, my parents came to the US late 80s, early 90s, late 70s, early 80s, and they both worked in restaurants and cleaning homes and mowing lawns, and so I am very lucky to be the recipient of this lifestyle that I have, which is I'm able to build businesses and take way more risk than they ever could have. And so to that, I will say there's a version of our life that we all have to take care of. When I first started my business, I was driving, I believe it was 4,100 rides over the course of 1 year to pay the bills because they at the time I didn't have the same resources or Rolodex as a lot of my classmates did to reach out to rich uncles or investors of friends and family and things like that to start a startup. And so I just thought, I am only going to be 20 years old once. Why not? I can still drive an Uber. At the time, I had a car that was barely paid off. So I think everybody just needs to do what is right for them. But what I will say is that a lot of people rather live with the comfort of the problems that they know than to live with the fear of all the uncertainties that they don't know. And I think if someone is thinking about potentially starting something, starting their own business or a project, I would first ask them to look in the mirror and say, why? Because are you trying to start a startup because you're truly passionate about a problem and to find a solution for it? Or are you starting a startup because that's what you think you should be doing? Because I certainly live in an ecosystem where people talk in AUMs and in valuations, right? People are constantly talking about 401ks and not 401ks, A's, company
Okay.
valuations and things like that. And nobody else in the normal world talks in those language, right? People simply want to just live a life and have a comfortable enough life and then have some growth in it and maybe grow a family or spend time with the people that they care about. And so if you're thinking about starting a business or a startup, I would first ask yourself really like what is the reason for it? And if you find those reasons to still be calling you and you're very clear and you feel very grounded, then you should do it because you only live once. And I think at the end of the day, when you interview again for a job in the future, it's better to be interesting than to be like everybody else with a similar resume.
Yeah, Jermaine, let's pause a minute to think about what you just said there, right? Which is the crux of it is gratitude. I know this conversation was not necessarily about gratitude, but that's what comes across to me, right? Thankful to your parents for the ability that they set up an environment and they gave you the foundation to be able to do what you're doing today, right? Two people had to work hard all their lives, could not afford to take chances, and they are able to make their next the generation, the offspring, take chances, right? So I think it's unrelated to the crux of our conversation maybe, but I think it's important to pause for a moment, because sometimes you're caught in the challenges of life, so to speak, where you simply forget the basic niceties and gratitude. Just be happy. I have a bunch of quotes in my office room. One of them that says, I think loosely, if I'm to paraphrase that, it says, I woke up, I have clothes to wear, I have running water, I'm happy. And you just look at those few words for a few minutes, you get the reality of the situation, right? Sometimes you forget it. You're looking at these fancy cars and things that you go outside that you lose a sense of maybe what's important, what's not. So I appreciate you sharing that. But somebody had to make those sacrifices to let another person, take those chances. So I can totally appreciate that. So thanks for sharing that. Now let's kind of switch gears. And again, this is in no particular order to tech stack. I was just curious to know how you go about, as somebody who's done this before and as somebody who's not necessarily an engineering founder per se, how do you go about identifying? I have a bunch of questions in the space, but the initial high level 50,000 foot question is, what does tech stack mean to you as a non engineering founder? Second part of that question is, how do you go about finalizing a tech stack for the problem that you're intending to solve?
For us, it was very clear from day one that security, integrity is going to be one of the most important things. It's actually the most important things because what our app is asking our users to do is to give us their most private information. So if I were building something else, maybe more casual, I think the tech stack would probably run somewhere along of like maximizing price, uptime, ease of build, probably. But because we are not like that, we've even been switching out our LLM wrapper, try to figure out because of things like terms and service. Because as you know, like no matter how well encrypted our data is, if OpenAI isn't doing the right thing, or if I guess our endpoints is not secure, and it doesn't really matter what we do. Like, so if the government subpoenas OpenAI for our data, our users' data, like I think there's really not so much we can do. And so I think our consideration this whole time has just been like, what is the most secure way and what is the best way to encrypt everything end to end without losing speed in our conversations. So our orchestrating agent, I think we've built everything on Rails on the front. And yeah,
I think, I liked your answer and I'll tell you why. If you'd asked me before we built our first product, as somebody who had been building software for years, my answer would have been very different. And in hindsight, I can tell you, I love your answer. I'm being honest here, more than my own answer, which I would have had. And here's what I mean by that. As somebody who had worked in the space of building software and as an engineering founder, it's a double-edged sword, right? On one side, even with or without AI, I could go about doing things because I had done it plenty of times before. But the way I looked at things was may or may not necessarily be the right way. And I'll tell you why I particularly liked your answer there. You did not mention, you mentioned Rails towards the end, but not in the context of the answer. You didn't mention that, hey, I would pick a technology stack because I love Python. I like React. I like Next.js. I like these APIs. I like AWS, Azure, Oracle or Postgres. You said you would have picked something because of the user interfaces and how if it was a more casual app, you had other requirements for what a tech stack would become. But since in this case security was most important, that is what drove your choice of technologies per se. Now, to me, this is the fundamental difference between a non technical founder and a technical founder. And in my opinion, this is how it should be, right? Even for technical founders. But the problem is sometimes since we fall in love with technologies more than the problems that we are solving, because a lot of times you're solving other people's problems, working for other companies. So we are not so close to the problem as we are to the technology. So I would be like, yeah, Jermaine, let's use Rails. I love Ruby. Or in the last few years, I fell in love with Golang. I'm going to say, let's go with Golang. So the choice of technology and the tech stack was, if you note carefully here, was driven by Krish's interests, what Krish wants to do, right? Now, some developers would go by what they have done. I do quite the opposite, which is what I have not done because that piques my curiosity and interest. But I don't think both answers are anywhere as near as being right. So I just want to summarize that, at least in my own words, to some extent, and tell people watching this that the choice of technology should be driven by the problem that you're solving, but there's other things that should drive that. So rather than me speak, Jermaine, I'm going to let you complete the thought process, if you will. What are some things, what are some factors that would play a role before you pick a technology stack, right? If you could go top to bottom, doesn't matter. I just want to know what are some determining factors that will drive your choice of technologies today?
So we have a few things, which is we're trying to explain a difficult concept to the general public, assuming that their understanding of this difficult legal concept is limited. And so, next to trust and data security, we bring on the ability to animate. And so, actually, I'll take it to a very simple level. Our landing page that you showed earlier used to have a lot of animations. And we tried to build different animations of zooming in and out and different toggles and things like that. But at the end of it, we looked at our heat map, our data from the users that are coming into the website. It shows that when they are looking at the animation, nobody is reading the text. And the text is actually super, super important to explain the product and our commitment to data security. And what we realized is that it didn't serve its core purpose, which is to explain and really ultimately drive conversion. And so we swapped out all of those beautiful designs for a fairly static website with a few GIFs. And I think that really just summarizes how we've been thinking about this. And all this really goes back to the resourcefulness of my co-founders, Mikey and ZJ, because their ability to see it objectively and say, we spent all this time on the design, on how we engineered this, but because it's not serving the goal, which is conversion in this case, then we're going to get rid of it. And we'll just figure out what is the best for what we're trying to achieve here.
Makes complete sense. Let's switch gears for a bit to sales. Now, as again an engineering founder, when I started the company, I thought engineering would be the most difficult thing. Fast forward years, I figured as difficult as it could be, given that we have done it plenty of times, we knew how to get past those challenges. The ones we didn't expect, had no clue about. There were many, more than one, sales being at the top of that list. So, how do you go about selling what you're building?
Sales is different, of course, from the kind of target that you're selling to. For who we're selling to, which is the middle of the bell curve, the average American in all 50 states. I think one mindset that I had that is super, super helpful for me is to not assume that what worked last month is going to work tomorrow. So I'll elaborate on that. I think the attention shifts and the algorithms of where the attention are. So all the social media platform, even Meta's ad platform are constantly shifting to learn, how do users' behavior changing and all the time that they're spending on the screen and how is that scroll changing all the time. And so maybe a younger me in my 20s would have made this mistake more often, which is I would look at the best practices of the last 6 months or even the last year or so and be so committed to it, to try it. But as I progress in my career and having more experience, what I realize is that if you know how to spot a pattern, which is the emerging underpriced attention, is always where you want to be as a startup because that's the attention that you can afford. By time articles and YouTube videos are made about it, it's probably too expensive for a startup to go. So in today's world, it's probably Meta ads because in 2026 January, organic content on TikTok and Instagram actually works much better than the paid content. There's a chance of virality that we didn't have maybe for the last few years because the last few years was so focused on meeting all the quarterly deadlines of the ad spends. And so the mindset that we have now is that we're going to try a lot of things as long as it fits in the brand of building trust with our target audience. So that's the only rule that we have is whatever content we try online, it has to maintain a level of trust building.
Okay, couple of things. One of the things you said there was organic content seems to actually resonate more than spending money on ads, correct? That's what you said, right?
In 2026 January, yes.
Wow. And then, okay, let's say you're creating organic content. Couple of things I want to ask in that regard is, do you create content that's specific to the problems you're solving, or do you create content that's unrelated yet to bring people into your realm and sphere of influence from an awareness standpoint?
I think neither actually. I think to create content, the way we're looking at it at least is there's education and entertainment. no matter which side of it. So if we're educating someone about the topic, that's one. Or if we're entertaining someone to bring their attention to the topic, that's the other version of it. But both of it should be selling the pain point that they have. So for us, the pain point is many people know that they should have a will, but for one reason or another, they haven't done it yet. So they have a procrastination problem, right? This feeling or this preconceived idea that getting it done is difficult. And so all of our content or our ideas are geared towards that. And part of the reason why I'm going on podcasts to talk about Airlight is also because podcasts is the long form way of building trust with a potential audience. And if I were to made a mistake in my strategy, I would probably be talking to, let's say, estate planning attorneys or family planning or financial planning people, where the audience have most likely already know about estate planning. But my goal is to not to talk to the same people there because I want to bring the awareness to people who don't normally cross path with making a will. And so my target, my go-to-market strategy is actually to go on as many podcasts as possible, of which the audience have one thing in common, which is they are likely considering or going through a life change. So that could be a career change, that could be having kids, buying homes, loss of a parent, or anything that changes in life.
Makes sense. One thing I want to understand, make sure I understood correctly, was you said it was neither. What does that mean? In other words, my question, just for my understanding, was would the content, let's say you said education or entertainment, right? So would it be content educating what it means to have or not have a will, or entertainment related to something funny that talks about this? Or is it something unrelated, meaning you could make a video about procrastination that has nothing to do with will, right? Or life. But then people find a liking and then they're like, okay, who is this person? What is this company? And then they stumble into the core business that you do. But the way they found you was through a video that was quite unrelated to your core business. Which of it is it, or is it somewhere in between?
It's closer to the first one, but the reason why I say neither is because I think the people who know they need to have a will, they know. So I'm not trying to tell them that they need to have a will, but I'm rather trying to speak to their pain point, which is the procrastination piece, which is the forms are too confusing, lawyers are too expensive, and Googling is just not working. And so I'm trying to speak to their pain point, and so that I can help them bridge that awareness of they know they need a will and that I have a solution that is not what they have considered before.
Makes sense, right? So more like, I was told by one of the best sales engineers that I know that, Krish, you got to sell the story because nobody's going to remember the product, right? I ran into a founder of, not a sales engineer, this is a different person who runs a data center company as CEO. I met him at one of the conferences. Really nice guy, and he told me, Krish, I talked to him about the product and Snowpal and what we do, and he said, you've got to sell the story, right? Because that's what people remember. Because when he talked about data centers and the energy consumption, the way he explained it was through references to homes and a lot of other funny anecdotes and whatnot. So he's like, hey, if people forgot everything about what I said, at least they would remember the story there essentially. So, yep, makes complete sense. So, as we get to sort of the tail end of this, there's a few other things I want to ask you. But before I did that, and also you mentioned a younger you in the 20s. As you were talking, I thought you were in your teens. So I was like, oh, younger you in the 20s. Okay. So Jermaine, do you have any questions for me? Before I get to the last leg of my questions, do you have any for me?
Yeah, I'm wondering, if you think about this, how everything we've talked about, how do you think the B2B sales go to market mindset differs from what we've discussed about my B2C?
Great question, right? So in other words, let me make sure I understood. So in other words, compared to a B2C product, which we also have, right? Our initial products are B2C. The question is, was it mostly the product market fit, identifying product market fit?
Or how do you market? What is your mindset marketing Snowpal?
Okay. So it's still work in progress, so please take this with a grain of salt. Sometimes each of us has a skill that's remarkably better than some other skill that we might have, right? It's just, I think it's for everybody. So you're able to do more with the skill that comes naturally to you and do much lesser with the skill that you actually have to manufacture. For me, that is sales, right? It's just not some, I mean, I like talking to people without an agenda, but having to have a conversation with somebody with an underlying agenda is not something that certainly comes naturally. So I've had to change or pretend to have changed over the years. The thing we do primarily is on LinkedIn, right? We prospect, we do a fair bit of research, we look for people, we prospect, but that's a laborious process, right? We do that, but that takes a lot of time and plenty of time. So we tried using other tools, right? For B2B, especially, we try to use sales automation tools. They promise a lot. They're like, hey, you know what? You can send it to 1,000 people a day or 500 people a day. And then you pay for that subscription and quickly realize that you can send 200 emails a day. 190 of those emails will end up in spam. And as these emails, clients and servers have gotten better, they send everything to your spam folders, right? So nothing ever hits the inboxes. So there's a dramatic challenge there. There's only a small subset of your emails that end up going through. Now you're in a world where how do I figure how to do this best? Because do I want to send 200 a day with 20 of them showing up? But by virtue of doing 200, Jermaine, we did not curate that list as carefully as we would if we had to go to LinkedIn, because finding 10 people takes 2 hours, right? Not 200 people. So our combination has then been creating content organically, right? A lot of time, which was originally spent on writing code and building more software and features, now, for whether I like it or not, it ends up being spent on other things peripheral to the core business, which is building software. So we built 8 APIs with 1,500 endpoints. It's a lot of software, right? A lot of software. And a lot of it was done before AI as well, right? So it was all handwritten per se. And it has a lot of functionality. But now, given the time we spend on everything else, that time is not, we're not able to churn out as many APIs anymore. But the natural shift in thought process has been, you know what? Let's sell a lot of the ones that we've already built and see how we have to keep up with what's changing, whether it's MCP, a layer atop those APIs, and people consuming and integrating, learning from people we talked to as well, because we had not initially planned to sell them as commercial licenses. We put them on AWS Marketplace. It took a lot of effort to get them on there. But one of our first calls, they were like, hey, you know what? We are not in the US. We don't want that to be in the US data center. So we need you to sell licenses. And we were not prepared for it at that point. So it's been constantly learning and finding out every time we have something. It's almost like the people come to you and ask you for the two things you don't have. And now you're in this challenge, right? A bit of a challenge, because do I now go add those features or build those APIs, or keep my focus to the ones we've built because we've got to learn more about them as well? So that's a very fluid space. And I will tell you, it's not easy. That's the obvious part. But the part that may not be obvious to founders or people who are looking to build software is things that you think are going to be the most challenging never end up being as challenging, maybe not as much. And the things you've never thought about become overwhelming, which is the reason we even started this podcast 3 years ago or so, Jermaine, which is to share our engineering learnings and also our non-engineering learnings, right? Because I didn't find any such content at the time, at least, where people told me, okay, how do I create campaigns on Meta and Google? What are some of the challenges you run into? Using Facebook or Instagram is super easy, but the internal tools built or external tools built by the same company from a B2B standpoint, that software is not that great. I've used Google campaign managers and whatever it's called, and it's got so many bugs and it's painful, right? It's not like searching on Google or going to YouTube. So, we create this content and share with people what we found, what we find along this topic. So our B2B approach has been creating content, finding a list on, LinkedIn, trying to reach out to them, and also being shameless to the extent that we can be. As an engineer, you're not built with that mindset, right? Hey, I can build software. I can do it without shedding my ego. But sales needs a lot of compromises and sacrifices. Somebody's going to tell you they'll come to a meeting, they may not show up. You can get upset about it, you can get pissed. You're going to have to, have a thick skin. and set up a second meeting with that same person who stood you up in the first meeting. A lot of those things are the most difficult things for us, right? So anytime we find to build software, that's a luxury because you're dealing with your machine and computers, and they're not biased and they're not judgmental or stereotypical, but humans are, right? So that's, I don't know if it answers your question directly, but those are some of the ways we go about solving our B2B problems. Because the B2C, at least we can place ads on Instagram and TikTok and Meta platforms and see what the response rates are and change differently. But B2B, the approach has been completely different. And one last thing I'll add there is, since we are selling APIs to companies that are building software, we have to find those companies that are actually building software and find out who the decision makers are within those teams, so the content and the reach out ends up being in the right place. And a lot of times it's not because you send to a director of engineering, that's great, but maybe the director of engineering does not have any authority over making some technology decisions in that company. But how are we to know that, correct? So we have to do the reach outs and then make some determinations based on that. But the sales tools that we've tried out, they used to be better 3 years ago, but given other technologies improving and spam and junk folders and whatnot, it's just not working. And some of those companies are even struggling to turn, report better numbers in their earnings. So, I mean, does that answer hopefully some of what you asked me there?
Yeah, yeah. I think you guys are definitely in the space and you're doing the right thing. LinkedIn content is probably the way to go, I would say. And it's funny because when you're saying that B2C, I know you don't mean it like just
Right.
literally, but B2C, you can post an ad on Instagram. The funny thing is, I almost think it's actually better and easier that you know who you're selling to so you can speak directly to them. Whereas right now, the B2C challenge for me is I have an avatar and I'm kind of selling to that avatar, but I have to constantly validate if this message selling to that avatar is still accurate. Whereas, thinking about a org chart, there's maybe 3-4 people that can make engineering decisions. And so I can speak directly to them because they would understand the solutions that you're providing in some ways. But it is difficult to stay focused, right? Because we're also often thinking, there's one thing that we discuss in our group chat all the time is like, hey, check out this reel. It's so funny. Maybe this can get some attention onto Airlight. And then we then have to pass through the filter. Well, is this joke or meme going to lose trust with the users we want? Will someone who comes to us by watching a reel, this specific reel on this topic, be comfortable to download an app and putting their most private information on it? And so, we're constantly playing this game as well. And so, yeah, we don't have it figured out, but it is, I think the joys of building a business is to be able to play this game to solve the puzzle.
Makes sense. One last question there was, you mentioned podcasts and a way for you to reach, your potential audience and whatnot. What are some of the tools you use to find these? Like, say I'm hosting a podcast, what are some ways you could recommend to people to find these podcasts and that make the most sense for you to probably go to? And how do you go about reaching out to them? What does that process look like?
So we have someone managing this, Ava. And the challenge is I've tried a bunch of tools, as you say, these cold emailing follow up tools. And I don't know for sure which ones are good yet. So I cannot really outright endorse any one of them. But as you kind of heard about how I found my co-founders/software engineers, I truly believe in this process of, figuring out a bigger data set and then distilling it down to what you need. And so with AI, you're able to pull a lot of data from, I think Spotify has data that's published. You can even now, in fact, go to Google and in the Ask tab, just ask it to summarize the video to give you the entire transcript. And I've been doing this a lot where I look at the entire transcript, I feed it into my chat GPT with very specific instructions of what I'm looking for within these conversations. And so it is a numbers game. I believe in the last 90 days, we sent about 7,000 emails to to various podcast hosts. This includes follow ups. And our email open rate is about 78%, which is very good.
Very
And
good.
our reply rate is just under 10%, which is incredible.
Which is amazing, I have to say, because if you had told me 5 years ago these percentages, I'd be like, why so low? But having been in the business, I know how big those numbers are. So anybody who doesn't appreciate the size of the numbers that Jermaine shared, it only means that you've not done it yourself. So you should definitely check out. But I totally appreciate the numbers game. There's no easy way to do most things, right? It's just there's no shortcut. It is laborious. Things do take time, but that's the nature of the beast. Running a business means, the last time I was on vacation, I cannot even remember when it was, right? But the thing is, when you start enjoying what you do, you're not missing out on those things that you think you would have to do to have fun, right? So I think it's sort of a delicate balance that you have to play. Okay, so we're going to shift gears for a little bit. How much more? Because this is amazing. By the way, I want to shift to a more casual part of this conversation, if you will, right? Just a more casual part, just to end the listeners with maybe a lighter thought process or something. I know we are a little bit past our time. How much time do you have, Jermaine, just from a time check standpoint?
Probably about 10 minutes more.
Perfect. I think
Yeah.
that's good. So, complete end of that segment of our conversation. Just a random bunch of hopefully funner things, if you will. You mentioned Malaysia, right? So, are you from Malaysia?
Yeah. I'm born in the US, but my family is Malaysian Chinese.
Which part of Malaysia is your family from?
Well, I lived for a part outside of KL, but my grandmother lives in KL right now.
The reason I ask is my wife is Indian, but she's from Malaysia. So she was born and she grew up there, and we go there all the time. Her family is there. Some families in Singapore, but it's a part of the world I truly love and enjoy. So I'm, just want to use the remaining few minutes just to talk about something outside the conversation we just had. So folks, for anybody who hasn't checked out Malaysia, right, I tell people whether it's the food or the country, it's one of the most beautiful places that I've been to, right? Just not just in South Asia, but in general. But even talking about people, I have a lot of people that matter to me, like who are in the not people I know personally, but so people haven't checked out. I don't know if you know Ronnie Chang, the guy who works at
Yeah.
the Daily Show.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we went to his show in DC, and he's like outstandingly funny, right? He is, I believe, from Malaysia as well. And then Uncle Roger, the guy who creates these food videos. I don't know if you've seen on YouTube. I think he's Malaysian, and Stephen Hay, if I remember. These are three people that are incredibly smart and funny. So we watch them like all the time. Anything you want to share with our audience about folks who probably don't know Southeast Asia, haven't been there? Just a few things about that part of the world.
Yeah, I mean, we can even stay on theme with technology because some of Malaysia's incredible entrepreneurs has made it. There's a more recent one of a woman who sold her e-commerce company to Walmart, but I just cannot think of her name right now. But the CEO of Broadcom, Hawk, is from Malaysia,
From
and
Penang, right?
so
Yeah.
yes, yeah, so he's obviously Broadcom is a very influential company, and then I'm trying to think. There's probably like a bunch more of Malaysians in tech that I'm just missing out right now. But I do know that there's a whole bunch of very incredible Malaysian talent. Aside from that, Michelle Yeoh is from Malaysia. In fact, she's from the same town as my mom in Ipoh. And so,
Wow. And Ipoh is one
yeah,
of those really, it's on the way to Penang, if I'm not wrong. It's a very beautiful part of the country. But Jermaine, more than that, thank you for sharing that. Also, want to sort of hear from you about the country, right? Just if people are visiting Malaysia, what are some things you might tell them just from a fun standpoint?
yeah, I think Malaysia, unfortunately, is not known for the best things in the West. You know, I think if you ask about Malaysia, people probably know positively about Petronas because there's a Formula One team,
Right.
Mercedes AMG Petronas. But, more recent years, Malaysia has been famous for the corruption, unfortunately, with MDB, the Wolf of Wall Street movie, or the
Or
plane,
MH370, yeah, the plane, yeah.
Yeah, the plane. However, I think I truly learned to appreciate my background as a Malaysian Chinese only recently because as I grew up in the US or spent a lot of time of my childhood in the US, one of those things is as an immigrant, it's like try to speak English, try to basically be a white person, for lack of a better word. But I'm now 34, and so as I get older, I have come to appreciate more of my background, which is in the most true sense, I am one third American, one third Malaysian, and one third Chinese. I still speak Mandarin. I can understand Bahasa. I also speak like Spanish and a bunch of random other languages. But as I get older, I really do appreciate much more because Malaysia is this place where there are probably 7 or 8 different races, three being the Malays and Indians and Chinese being the top three. And it's a place where my neighbor in KL was a Christian, Protestant Christian, and on the other side is a Muslim, and my family's Buddhist. And we just coexist in this space and are able to understand each other and just be neighbors. And I think it is in many ways like the United States, where the topic of race is at the forefront of everything. And I don't think it needs to be. I think a lot of times what we should take away from being in such a diverse place is that we are actually so much more similar. But of course, because of what we see on social media, the sensationalism of everything, it's hard for us to remember sometimes that our neighbors are quite similar to who we are, despite being so unique in our own ways. So
You know,
Malaysia is such a great place.
you summarized that beautifully, and I'll tell you, Germany, if you ever want to come back to the podcast and talk exclusively about immigration, I'm happy to do that because I had a great conversation with a recent guest where we talked about something else entirely, her business and the way from a technical standpoint. I just asked a question about immigration, and the conversation became so interesting that we ended up doing a continuous call, having an extended conversation about immigration, and a lot of what you shared here resonates with me straight away, right? So please, anytime you want to talk about this, and it's more contextual in the day and age that we live in, that I think people do appreciate that on both sides of the spectrum. So as we close this, last one or two last questions is, what is your favorite food? Like, if you have to pick one dish, what would that dish be? And again, maybe people know it, maybe they don't, so you're going to have to explain that. I'm going to take a wild guess and be stereotypical, given what my wife, she loves Malaysian food, obviously. And I was born and raised in India. When I got married, she cooks a lot of Chinese food, and even anything else that she cooks has a very strong Chinese influence to it. I fell in love with Chinese food so much. So that's pretty much all that we eat all the time. But the thing is, I'm only used to American Chinese. So when I go back to Malaysia, it is so much more authentic that it's not easy for me to appreciate that food as much because it's too authentic, right? I'm just used to the Americanized version of Chinese that I find in the country here. That's just a background. So I was going to guess like nasi lama or something, but that's just a random guess. Tell me what your favorite dish is.
My favorite thing to eat that's on my mind right now is a El Pastor taco.
Nothing to do with Malaysia. Okay,
Nothing to do
thank
with
you.
Malaysia. Yep. I love it because it's one of those things. It's from Mexico City, and a proper El Pastor taco has it's pork, and it's marinated it's like cooked like a kebab. It's grilled on this thing that rotates next to the fire with a piece of lemonade, typically served on corn tortilla. It's yeah, I just love it. I have this ridiculous hobby. If you look it up, Jermaine 1000 taco. I ate 1000 tacos at some point and documented every single one of it. And I went to more than 10 countries, more than 10 states in the US, and more than 13 states in Mexico to try tacos. And so I've been
Wow,
on this
that's
journey of trying a bunch of tacos, and I am way past 1000 now. I stopped counting and stopped posting. But El Pastor taco is something that I think about often.
how should we find it? You said Jermaine 1000 tacos, right?
Yeah, it's actually an Instagram account that doesn't really I don't really post much anymore because I changed it from 1000 taco to 1000 burgers.
Okay.
Even though I should probably not eat 1000 burgers, I think it's bad for my health.
No, that's all right. Okay, that we will definitely look it up. I usually don't ask this to my guests, but since you're from Malaysia, this is going to be a bonus question to you. What is your favorite Indian food?
I like the dosai.
Okay.
So depends on
Where
where it's from. In Malaysia, I think they call it tosai, but in India it's dosa.
Correct. And I think that's great. So they make a 1 billion of them. And just to add to what you mentioned there, the Indian population in Malaysia is predominantly South Indian, right? From the part of the country that I come from in India. So it's the food in Malaysia is very much like the food I find in my state in India. So it's dosai. Dosai is the Tamil version of it, right? Tamil is the language essentially, right? But the dosa is the non-Tamil, non-authentic reference to it. The I is just gone missing. In Malaysia, they just spell it with a T, but in India, we spell it with a D, as in, dog
I
at the
have
top,
I have
essentially.
been to northern India, by the way. I went to Taj Mahal last year, and I went to Agra for Holi. So we played Holi with a local family, and then of course spent some time in Delhi. So it's quite an experience. Yeah, I
I
love it.
can, plus, the fact that you have exposure to Indians in Malaysia who are predominantly against South Indian, going to Delhi means you get the other flavor, one part of at least the other part of India, essentially, so to speak. Amazing. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, Germany. Again, definitely look up Germany at Airlight. Any closing comments to our audience, Jermaine? And if you can, it doesn't have to be, but if you can, target folks who are getting out of college, young graduates, recent graduates, and folks who've been in the business of building software for a little bit. It doesn't have to be, but if your closing comments could sort of have something to do with each of these segments of population, what would that essentially be? And then we could call it done. And please don't drop off after you say that. Just hang on for a minute after that. Please go ahead.
Yeah. I think I'm going to give a general life advice that I've been thinking a lot about, which is oftentimes people tell us that time flies. But the truth is, time actually doesn't fly. It's that we forget a lot of it. And so we forget all the things that we're doing day to day. We forget of all the little things, the little difficult moments and joyous moments, because we don't really have a habit of writing these things down. And so time doesn't fly. We have to remember that if we want to remember those things, we got to live it a little bit more intentionally. And that means planning ahead of prioritizing things that matter to us and also spending time to build things that matter to us. And so that is the mission of Airlight, and that's the mission that I am on.
Thank you so much. Much appreciate your time. And we'll call it done with that comment of Jermaine. Thanks a lot, Jermaine.
Thank you.